So today I'm having, let's see if I can show this to you without overexposing it, Norseman gin, which is a strawberry rhubarb gin, which I am very partial to. And for today's tonic, it's Fever Tree elderflower. And again, another one of my favorites. So I always spend so much time getting media ready for the questions I'm about to answer. I always, every week, I'm like, next week I'm going to make a good cocktail and I'm going to show off. And then I end up having no time. So there you go. It's April 17th. Thank you all for attending Happy Hour with Alexis Van Hurkman. We have some really interesting questions this episode. And before that, I'm going to share my screen so that I can give a huge shout out to Blackmagic Design for sponsoring this series. If you don't already know, Blackmagic Design is the company behind DaVinci Resolve. They are also behind all kinds of really swell kit, like the new A10 Mini Pro, a bunch of cameras that are really cool. I'm actually grading an Italian short film right now that was shot using a Blackmagic camera, so that's fun. And all kinds of gear that is affordably priced and high quality. So if you're not already using Resolve, hopefully listening to the answers to some of these questions will make you think about it. And if you are using Resolve, I'm here to help you try to get a little bit more out of it. So I also want to give a shout out to Flanders Scientific. They are not sponsoring this series, but they are offering discounts to independent operators who need a break because they need a display because they're working at home for the first time and they want to be able to interface well with their clients. So if you're an indie operator and you need a little bit of help and you need to get a color critical display, go ahead and give them a call, tell them your situation. I'm told they'll work with you. I want to also give a shout out to Gaia Mount and the producer that I've been working with, Wang Sunjun, for allowing me to use footage from Carry My Heart to the Yellow River in this little project of mine to be able to do demos. So thank you, Sanjun. And lastly, this is my website, vanhurkman.com, if you want to read more about what I write, about color correction, about media, about filmmaking and directing. Come on by here. There is pinned to the very top a post about this Q&A. And if you've already registered through Zoom, you don't have to register again to keep attending. But if you want to ask me a question, here is the form you can submit to give me your question. And I'm trying to get through all of them, but it may take a few episodes for me to catch up. So that is that. And then lastly, I want to mention that all of the episodes are being posted on YouTube. I've got a playlist on the Bog Simple Productions channel. And you can go ahead and catch up with any ones that you've missed. And in the future, if you miss one, they're all here. So tell your friends. We're really talking about some fun stuff in this series. And I'm having some really great conversations, which for me is the real point. I love talking to all of you out there and finding out how you're using Resolve, what issues you're having. Everybody works differently. And this is a great way for other people to hear how you work and not just how I work. So that said, let's get into the questions. Last week, I said that this week was going to be ACES week, and it is. I have a bunch of questions about ACES in DaVinci Resolve, so I'll be doing those in the first half. And then I have a bunch of really interesting questions spanning grading and a little bit of editing later on. I hope the people that ask those questions can show up. But I'm going to start with a question I'd gotten that I hadn't quite expected, which is from Chris Oben, who doesn't look like he's on here. But Chris Oben asked me, what is my contribution to the current DaVinci Resolve manual? And those of you who know me this is a great chance for you to go out and get yourself a cocktail to drink while you're waiting around, because you've already heard all this. Those of you who don't, yes, I do in fact write the DaVinci Resolve manual. And it's one of those things where even though it's common practice in the tech industry to not provide credit for tech writers in manuals, who would claim to be that who was not? So this is the DaVinci Resolve manual. Right now it's in, where is it? Yeah, the December 9, 2019 release was the last release we did. And up till now, I've been, actually, I should say up till this year, I have been the sole author of the manual. So it's up to, God, what is it? 3,000 odd pages. I was the one responsible for developing the vast, vast majority of that. There have been chapters here and there that have come in from other contributors, but it's been my job as a consultant with DaVinci to maintain this, to figure out how to explain all the new features and all the cool things that are being added. I see Rob Trombino trying to get me to tell you what's coming in the next version of Resolve. Nice try. I'm not going to do that because I've signed an NDA. So I really, honestly have been writing all of this. Now, starting this year, I've finally gotten some help because it was, 3,000 pages of documentation is too much for one person. So I have Dion Scorpatulo, who's a trainer out in the space. I'm sure some of you know him or have at least heard his name. He is helping me out with all of the Fusion page documentation. Really, he's taken the lead with that, and I've been working with him on figuring out where we can take that documentation to make it more useful for people. And then a colleague of mine, John Burkhart, has come on board as my right hand with the rest of the documentation. So that's been a huge help for me, and it's really allowing me to focus on areas of the docs that I think can use a little bit more attention. So, and actually, I have violated my own workflow here because I was all set to start using headphones. So let me get those on. And really, that's all I'm going to say about working on the manual. So yeah, now I'm going to be one of those guys wearing headphones, just because turns out it makes editing later on easier. I'm learning how to do this stuff as I go, which is always fun. But yeah, so let me get into the ACES part of things. And I've had a whole lot of people asking me about ACES. Diego, are you out there? Diego, yes, there you are. I'm going to allow you to talk because you were another person who asked questions about ACES.
Hey, Alexis, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. Normally, like every day is the same.
So this is becoming a habit. You came on last week's show, so welcome back. And you asked a good question. So I'm just going to run through the 3 questions I got to start out about ACES, because they're all very similar, and then you can elaborate on the question if you have more detail you want. But Ahmadallah asked, how do you see RCM versus ACES, Resolve Color Management versus ACES? Do I recommend one over another? And then Fleming Peterson asked, what is your experience with ACES? When is it an advantage to use ACES? And then you asked, how do the tools work in ACES?
Yes.
So these are all excellent questions. And I'm going to start, I'm going to answer these 3 in a batch. And if you want me to elaborate, Diego, if you see, if you hear something you want more information on, just let me know. But Resolve Color Management versus ACES, I don't make a recommendation that you should use one or you should use the other. You should use what fits your workflow. And it's funny because I took another look at the documentation that I wrote about color management, because there's a whole chapter about color management in the documentation. And I wanted to just double check what did I say about RCM and what did I say about ACES, because it's been a while since I've read it. So I write a lot about Resolve color management because it bore explanation. And when it came to the ACES section, I didn't write nearly as much because, for one thing, setting up ACES is actually a little bit simpler. And for another thing, at the time that I wrote the ACES documentation, ACES was still a work in progress. And my assumption was that if you knew what ACES was, then you knew what you wanted to do with it and why. And I didn't need to spend a whole lot of time explaining what color management was to that audience. But several years have now passed, and ACES has become more of a known quantity, more of a known workflow. And I realized that a lot of the questions people have about ACES are things that I haven't taken the time to explain in the documentation. So it's something I'm going to be looking at, but I can go ahead and kind of sum up the main thing about ACES that I think is confusing a lot of people, which is that when
I think what is happening also maybe.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, is that most of the information that you find about ACES is really, really technical, really.
Oh yes, so, that's true. That's very true.
So that's in some way a problem, because in some way if you want to like make simple things, they put maths, they put many things, and it gets messy. I think so.
No, I agree. I totally agree. And really, the way I write the docs and the way I like to try and explain things is very much from an artist's perspective. So, you know, as you say, you go to the ACES website, was it acescentral.com, and there's tons and tons of information, but the information is really dense and technically sophisticated. And so it can be hard to parse for someone that just wants to figure out what's the best artistic way for me to handle this program. So getting back to kind of the top level thing that I wanted to share is that when you use ACES, you are pretty much working in a log workflow. You're working in a very kind of traditional film log workflow where you don't get to control the timeline color space. Now I'm gonna switch to Resolve, because just talking about this isn't necessarily gonna make things as clear as I want them to be. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open up a project that I created last week, which is all red raw footage. So, and I'm just gonna check on what kind of grades I've got in here. I don't have any grades, good. And I think if I go into my color management, yeah, I actually have this set up for ACES right now. So I'm gonna switch this back to DaVinci YRGB so that everyone can see this is just the raw footage set up. If I go into my camera raw settings, this is the way the camera metadata happened to be set up. So I could switch this into project, and if I wanted to switch into an IPP2 workflow, if I wanted to work without any color management, the way we work right now, I could simply manually set every red raw clip in the whole project to whatever I want it to be. Now, in this case, I'll choose red wide gamut RGB, and I'll choose log 3 G10, and I click save. And now I'm in this log-like red workflow, and I can just manually grade. And whatever I output is relative to whatever I'm monitoring. So if I've got my monitor set to, Rec 709, then I'm grading with a Rec 709 output just by default, just based on the decisions that I'm making. Ditto with P3, ditto with Rec 2020, yada, yada, yada. So the advantage of any color managed workflow is it is designed to take into account the source color space of each piece of media that I have. So if I shot a production with 3 different cameras, I could tag each of the clips of media if they're transcoded, or I don't have to do anything if they're not transcoded, if it's raw media. Those clips will automatically be converted into my working color space in such a way as to line up the colorimetry of each different camera so that all of the color of all of those clips occupy the same color space. And then there's a switch on output that lets me be explicit about how that footage is going out to the user. And by working in that way, and that's why if I open this up, go back to color management, this is kind of the simplest way of describing DaVinci YRGB color manage. So I choose that. All of these controls come online. I can choose an explicit input color space. I can choose an explicit timeline color space, and I can choose an explicit output color space. Now, this project is already set up for me to work in the timeline with red wide gamut RGB log 3G10, which is going to be a little bit more work for me to grade, but it's going to give me the widest possible, cleanest gamut data to work with. And I've had numerous conversations with the man who does the color science for DaVinci Resolve, Michael Chenery. And our thinking has evolved over the years. The current thinking is that having the timeline color space be wide is a real benefit. And yes, it's going to make the controls work a little bit differently than if you were simply working in Rec 709. But if you want the nth degree of quality, and especially if you're grading HDR footage, if you're going to a wide gamut, there are real benefits there. If you're not going to a wide color space, yeah, you can set timeline color space to Rec 709, and the controls will feel largely the same as they do when you don't use color management. It's still going to be a little different. But it won't be as different as working in a wide gamut. But you have the choice. And I think this is what distinguishes Resolve color management, is that it's a Swiss Army knife. You can mix and match all these different settings for every single one of your necessary transforms, from source to timeline to output. And furthermore, you do have the option of separating the color space and the gamma or EOTF so that you really can get explicit control over exactly what color space you want to work on at each step and exactly what gamma you want to work on at each step. So, and all of this additionally, you can see over here, is encapsulated in plugins like the Color Space Transform plugin. So you can actually use all of this transform math without turning on color management. So there's a very complete set of tools under the hood. And in fact, all of the LUTs that Resolve ships with match, as much as a LUT can, these operations. So however you want to work at whatever, in whatever combination of workflows you need to accommodate, Resolve color management gives you enormous flexibility. Now, the flip side of that is you have all this stuff you can do. And if you first get exposed to color management and you've got all these settings you can choose, it can be a little bewildering. So there's a lot to learn. You have a lot of power, but you have to take a lot of responsibility if you're using Resolve color management. But also, Resolve color management comes the closest to letting Resolve's controls work largely the way you're used to. Largely. So that's a benefit of using RCM. Is it better than ACES? No, it's not better than ACES. It's simply different in its approach to helping you structure all of the color transforms coming into Resolve from your source media and going out of Resolve to whatever destination you're going to. So is that explanation of RCM fairly clear, Diego?
Yes,
Does
yes,
that make
definitely.
sense? Okay.
Yes, yes. What I feel also is, as you say, I mean, it's a big responsibility, but it's also a little bit dangerous, I think so, because if you don't know like all of the science about the camera and so, it can be a problem. There are so many options, I think so.
It's true, but and it's funny because I was giving a presentation about this to people at SIGGRAPH. This was a couple years ago, and it hadn't occurred to me to be explicit about, if you're using raw media, Resolve automatically knows how to convert raw media into the timeline color space. You don't have to tag raw media manually. You don't have to know where it came from. You don't need to know anything about it, because raw media is simply automatically transformed into the timeline color space using the colorimetry that DaVinci received from the camera manufacturers about the best way of transforming that camera colorimetry. So if it's raw media you're working with and you've got 5 kinds of raw media,
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about it. You basically just turn it on and things happen. And all you need to know is what timeline color space you want to use and what's your output color space, and you're off to the races. Where you need to know stuff is if you have a bunch of transcoded media. And this is not an uncommon workflow at all. In fact, I still hear people debating, is it worth working with with raw and dealing with those big files and all that management, or do we simply record log encoded media in ProRes or DNxHR and have an easier life because now we've got more compressed media that's still high quality and it's log encoded so it can be graded? If you do that, yes, then you have to know, I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to see if I go into the edit page so I can see. Oh, great. I've got all this offline media. So with Resolve color management turned on, I can select one or more clips. And if I right click them, there's an input color space and an input gamma set of menus. So if you have transcoded media, this is where you need to go in and select all the clips that were recorded on red cameras and choose the red settings, right? And then you have to choose all the Canon cameras and choose whatever appropriate Canon settings. And then you choose all of your Blackmagic cameras and you use the appropriate Blackmagic settings based on how you set the camera up. And this is where you're absolutely correct. You have to have some record keeping from the client or the people who, assembled the image, the camera team, about what these settings should be. Otherwise, you're going to have a little bit of trial and error. And I've certainly run into that where I've gotten media from a project and I said, great, it's Canon log. Which camera log setting did you use? Well, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, there's one of 3 possibilities. I'll just flip through each one and see what gives me the best starting point. The good news is if you choose a setting, if you tag media in a subtly wrong way, it's not It's not, say, Canon log 2, you choose Canon log 3 because you thought that looked best, but it turns out that Canon log 2 was really what they used. That's not a problem. You're not going to break anything. The bottom line is, as long as your data is grading well, all the gradations are smooth, and it looks good, that's fine. If you pick the wrong tag, it's not going to destroy your project. You know, it's just you chose an initial color state that was slightly different. Not a big deal. Now, if you choose a radically wrong thing, you're going to see it. It's going to obviously not be good. So you don't have to worry about that. But if you are working with raw media, you don't have to worry about this. It's largely automatic. So it's not as it's not as complicated as all that once you get used to it. And that's really kind of the thing. One of the things I do to try and make this whole process easier is I will use smart bins. And I'll use smart bins to sort out media from every camera that I know that I've got to make this easier. So if I use file name contains R3D and I create a smart bin, now I've got a smart bin that automatically shows me all the R3D media. And all I've got to do is just select all that media or Command A, and now I can tag it and done. Now this is raw media, so I can't tag it, but the other thing I could do is add a smart bin, and I'm looking for .mov, create smart bin. So, okay, now this is all my QuickTime media. I just select all, and I can tag it, and I'm good. So this is one technique I use to make tagging transcoded media work better. So that's the story for RCM, but I said I was going to talk about ACES. So here's the comparison. And I'm going to go back into the color management panel, and I'm going to switch this from DaVinci YRGB color managed to ACES CCT. Now, one of the questions undoubtedly many people out there have is, what is the difference between ACES CC and ACES CCT? And again, the real conversation is very mathematical and very intense. And the available ACES settings have actually changed over the years, as the ACES consortium has discovered that just because a workflow is mathematically pure doesn't mean it's pleasurable to colorists. And so, or useful in a VFX pipeline. So these two settings are different ways of handling the log data that you're working with when you're within the ACES workflow. And ACES CCT specifically was developed to make grading the shadows a little more quote unquote normal relative to what colorists are used to. So I'm going to choose ACES CCT, and now I can choose the ACES version. There's ACES 103 and ACES 1.1. I'm going to stick with 101. This is only there for cases where, say, you did a project in ACES 103 and you have to de-archive that project because you need to do something else to it. And this lets you go back in time and use the correct version of ACES that you were grading to back then. But if you're doing a new project, you probably just want to use the new version of ACES, unless someone very important has told you otherwise, because every workflow is different. So now that I've chosen ACES 1.1, you can see I have two transforms that I get to pick. I get to pick the ACES input device transform, the IDT, and I get to choose the ACES output device transform, or ODT. And that's it. I don't get to choose what my working color space is. And this is central to understanding what's going on and why the controls feel the way that they feel. Because the next few questions I got were the question you asked: how do the tools work in ACES? David Broadbent, let me see if he's out there. I don't see him out there, but he was asking that the controls, particularly on the control surface, feel so different.
Yes, that's actually the easiest part, the setup.
Right. Yeah, the setup is easy, but it also explains, when you understand it, why things are the way they are. You don't get to choose the timeline color space because you aren't meant to grade any other way than Cineon-like log. That's it. That's the way ACES works. So when I click save here, what I end up with is footage that looks different, as you can see, than it looked when I chose, here, let me just flick back to YRGB color managed. You can see YRGB color managed, this image is a little more open by default. It's just, it is what it is. And the Resolve color management approach is all we're doing is transforming from the camera's native color space that you were using to the timeline color space that you want to work in, and then out. We're not adding any secret sauce. We're not doing anything to account for the way a projector is supposed to look or the way any given display is supposed to work, because again, RCM is a Swiss Army knife. So what you get out is pretty much what you were monitoring on set. ACES has a different approach. ACES has what's referred to as an RRT, a reference rendering device, that is meant to keep all images within this cinematic domain, you know, this ideal cinema presentation. And I've talked to different people, and I've heard this expressed in different ways. Oftentimes, I've heard the RRT is not intended to be a look, quote unquote. It's not intended to be a stylistic grade, but it is kind of a look, as you can see. Just turning ACES on without me doing any grading at all adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the image, which if you like that, that's great. And if you don't like that, that's the worst thing ever. And it really depends on what your creative approach is to grading, whether or not you're going to appreciate this. So my observation over the years is that at first I really didn't like the RRT. I didn't like the fact that I turned this on and now I'm kind of stuck grading underneath this concept of what the image should be. And again, this is a common transform, so this isn't meant to be the image. This is just kind of pushing you in a certain direction. But over the years, I've come to appreciate that there are projects where when you turn on ACES, things kind of look nice to begin with, and maybe you don't have to work so hard. And a colleague of mine, Robbie Carmen, who works in the DC market, Washington, DC market, we were talking about this one day, and he said that in his opinion, if you're grading ARRI Alexa footage, that the ACES workflow is fantastic. The colorimetry of the ARRI cameras really plays into what ACES was engineered to do. And that's cool. I don't hardly ever get RE footage. Pretty much all my projects that I get and everything that I direct has been on RED cameras for various reasons that have nothing to do with my choice. It just happens to be the way things go. But so I haven't experienced that particular brand of joy that Robbie is referring to, but I do get it. I do understand how that would be the case. So that said, that explains one of the principal differences between RCM and ACES, which is that ACES is steering the footage in a particular direction, whereas RCM is not. RCM, you do you, and we're not helping. So that's one major difference. But then the fact that you're working on log encoded footage, which you can see here, this is a compressed log waveform. And the reason that the image looks normal is because you're grading underneath the ODT. And that's the other thing to understand is you're not in your grade grading to normalize the footage. You're not building a grade that's going to take this image to Rec 709. The ODT does that. So you just make adjustments within log space to improve the image underneath what the ODT is doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that it was making
No,
sense.
I was just thinking that you explained really good, like the difference of the both most difficult things right now, you can say, like in the color world, that is like color manage and ACES. Thanks.
Sure. So to get back to the controls and really to dig into your question, if you use the primaries wheels, which is lift, gamma, and gain, this is the traditional DaVinci Resolve way of adjusting color and contrast. You are going to notice that things feel different. You know, you're seeing compression in the signal, and things don't quite necessarily work the way you expect them to work. And this isn't your imagination. I think a lot of people think, oh, I must be doing something wrong, or, you know, surely all of this just will work the way it always has. And the truth is no, because this is a log-like signal. You're intended to use a set of controls much more akin to the log controls, where you're grading with your offsets and you're, you know, using contrast controls and pivot, and you're using the shadow, midtone, highlight ranges to make adjustments. And, you know, it's a different philosophy of grading. You're more inclined to be probably working with DPs that want you to be getting into printer points, right, via the offset controls. They are more inclined, and this is to speak to a question that's going to come up later on about what is the most accurate way to adjust color temperature, or we didn't say color temperature, but you know, scenic temperature. And the film grading approach is to use offset to make more linear adjustments throughout the tonal range of your image, and then to use the shadow control to deal with any black contamination that might come up. And then you have midtone and highlight controls that are scaled for log ranges that are intended to let you do more specific things given the way that log works. So everything is a log workflow when you're working in ACES, and that's just the way it is. There's no way around that.
I'm making something, I don't know if I'm wrong. When I use a lot the offset, but the offset takes a lot of the mix of the image. So what I'm doing is that I change the gamma of the node to linear. I don't know if it's good what I'm doing, but I think that makes a little bit more, okay, that adjustment make a little bit more similar the offset than letting the node in the normal behavior of
Right,
ACES.
right. So for example, you're creating a new node and you're going into here and you're choosing the color space and gamma that you want that node to operate in. So that's, here's where I would kind of like to hear someone else's perspective, because, you know, first off, I don't do a lot of grading in ACES, but I know that that's kind of a hack. There's, in theory, there should be nothing wrong with doing that, but I know that's not necessarily the way ACES was designed to work, right? Because the other thing you could do, for example, is you could apply a color space transform to a node, grade in whatever you want, and then color space transform back out of it. But again, you're kind of adding complexity to your image processing pipeline that I don't know if that's really ideal or not. So I don't want to take a stand on that. I'm just communicating the intent as I understand it. Now, I'm kind of curious because, again, I am not the ACES guy. It's not something that I use regularly. And raise your hand if you use ACES in your professional life. I'm talking to all the attendees. Raise your hand if you use ACES regularly. Okay. I see you, Joe, but I'm going to talk to Nicholas because I've never talked to Nicholas before. Nicholas, I've turned you on. Are you there? Nicholas. I'll bet he's scrambling for his microphone. Oh shit, I didn't know he was going to want to talk to me. Oh no, oh no.
that's what we
Oh
feel.
no, he doesn't have a mic. Oh, that's so sad. I'm sorry, Nicholas. Well, you know what? I'm just going to talk to you and let you text me and I will read it. So, Nicholas, tell me, what kinds of projects do you use ACES for? TV shows. Okay. And are you using ACES because you prefer to work in ACES, or are you using ACES because this is the workflow that has been chosen by the client? Ah, so Nicholas is telling me that he doesn't use ACES in the color management setting. He uses ACES nodes to change exposure. So okay, I see what you're doing. So you're using ACES way of doing things inside of
YRGB.
a conventional YRGB workflow or RCM workflow. Yeah, okay. I get that. And that's kind of, I mean, this is where I get to be a salesman for DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci Resolve gives you the freedom to do crazy shit like that. You know, I'm grading just using my regular old way, but I want to duck into ACES space to do some stuff and then go back out to where I was. That is very cool. So I hadn't expected someone to jump there, but I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you, Nicholas. So I'm going to ask again, is there anybody else out there who has a microphone who uses ACES regularly? Because I'd like to hear from somebody else. Hello, Mark. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Hi. So you use ACES regularly?
Every project.
Okay. What kind of projects do you typically work on? What is your clientele?
All ARRI footage, ProRes Quad 4, and they're all the projects that go to cinema. So they're short forms.
Okay. Okay. And is ACES a workflow that you? I'm sorry, I was talking over you. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, is ACES something that you have selected to work with because you prefer it, or is it a workflow that you have been told this is what we're going to do and this is how you're going to do it?
You see, I'm a lecturer for the film school here in South Africa.
Okay.
And the workflow for our third-year students, because they're using ARIES and FS7s, and I like the ACES, especially the CCT, the T version, so they've got a little bit of more access to the shadows because they tend to want to always crush the shadows.
Yes, and actually, let me just pause you there because I can show people what you're talking about. If I go back into ACES CC, which was the original stab at trying to make a color correction ACES space for people, if I grade the shadows, they're all kind of tied to the bottom, and it makes it hard to do lifting operations the way that colorists are used to. So that's the difference between CC and CCT, and why most colorists prefer CCT. So anyway, so you're grading entirely within ACES. Do you grade log style, or do you have different nodes that you put into different color spaces to grade with?
No, keep it the log style. So it generally follows the natural way of grading. So they can get used to, or the students as well, they can get used to using the control panels with using sort of that log style of grading.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes a little bit more natural on the panels for them when they're grading.
Okay. Are you working with camera raw media?
So with the Arri Alexa, it's the ProRes Quad 4s, and then with the Sony FS7s, their footage, we tend to not raw. We'll tend to stay on the 4K. I think we use the DNX, not the MXF codec on that.
Okay. Okay.
So we don't generally. If we do raw projects, I mean, generally with the projects, we have about 20 projects going at a time, and we can't have all 20 projects in raw footage.
Oh, right.
So,
yeah, that would be an enormous amount of storage.
Well, we've got a huge amount of storage, but then the network access to that storage units would be unbelievable. So we generally try and stick to 1 or 2 projects in raw, and then we will go with ProRes RAW if we can, external recorders.
Okay. Okay.
But it's a good workflow. I prefer this. I prefer the workflow using the color space, the ACES in the color management side, than trying to put on the color space transformation nodes. I just feel it's a bit more intuitive, and it gives a little bit more control, I suppose.
That's great. That's great to
shadows.
That's great to hear, because I've, you know, as a colorist who is very much a lift gamma gain style colorist from the video world, getting into cinema tools like log grading took me a little bit of doing, because it does feel different. And so, but I talked to plenty of people who came up in that world and who say, like you know, this is a natural way of grading. If you understand the film negative, all of this makes perfect sense. It's what I'm used to. And lift gamma gain is a bizarre tool to me. So I was hoping to talk to someone like you to get that perspective, because a lot of Resolve colorists who either came up in Resolve with lift gamma gain, or who have come to Resolve from other video tool sets that use lift gamma gain like tools, look at this log grading thing as, what do I do with this? Everything up is down, down is up. The world is falling. I don't understand any of this. And suddenly I've become a bad colorist and I don't understand why. And, you know, the way the controls feel.
But I think you said,
the way the controls feel is, you know, most of that.
And I think what you said earlier on, it sounds extremely complicated when you first start out. But once you get the basics done, it becomes so easy to use the ACES workflow that you really don't want to use anything else.
Yeah. So to speak to David Broadbent's question about the control surfaces and is there any way to make them normal, my perspective is, and you know, Diego's workflow is not bad. Again, if and Diego, you're still live, so feel free to chime in
Yes,
here.
I'm here. Yeah.
But if you're getting good results from having one or two nodes where you're moving into a different color space to do something specific and then you're getting back out of it, you know, if it's not tearing up the image, great. Like that's why those tools are there. But I do get people who want to keep things clean in terms of just working with that log tool set. And I always like to point out that control surfaces are like instruments. And it takes practice to get fast at playing your instrument. And once you've gotten used to a particular scale, you can be fast. But if you choose a setting that changes the scale of your instrument, it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel awkward. And you're going to have to learn how to play the instrument in a different way. So that's my perspective these days is if you really want to get into ACES and you want to get into that workflow, it's a benefit to force yourself on a small project or a scene in your off time to come to grips with log grading, come to grips with that toolkit, and come to grips with the range that you have. And, you know, it's like when I started grading HDR, it's a little similar. HDR is a completely different way of manipulating the signal. And it took me a while to get to the point where I felt like I knew what I needed to do. And when I did it, I got a predictable result and it felt natural. It was a learning curve though, because HDR is similarly a log-like output signal that you're grading within. So the experience is different. So this is the only advice I have to give, and it sounds like there are multiple ways into the ACES workflow. So I really appreciate you chiming in. Is there anything else you would add, Mark?
Sure. With this lockdown that we're all having at the moment, the new Blackmagic micro panels that we ordered are waiting for me, and I haven't been able to open them up yet.
Oh no!
I know. It's like having our toys.
That's tragic. You got the mini?
We ordered a few mini panels. We have the Avid Artists, and they are kind of cumbersome with the Ethernet connections at the back, the older ones. And we've decided now to get all the micro panels, and they're waiting. And this silly lockdown it's like a toy that you can't get to.
Oh God, that's so sad. That's so sad, especially because now you've got all the time in the world to play around with them, right? Yeah. I gotta say, and yeah, sure, I'm shilling for Blackmagic, but that mini panel is really nice. It is a nice panel. It's well built.
Well, so, looking forward to using it.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks, Diego.
Thank you.
If anyone has any other questions, actually, and I do see a question that I'll just go ahead and let's see. Nathan Morgan had a question. I'm going to go ahead and put you on if you're still there, Nathan Morgan. Oh, looks like I lost him. He asked one problem we often run into with ACES and RCM is that timeline effects will always process in the timeline color space, which can be a problem with effects that are designed to work in Rec 709. Any tips for working with plugins that may not be color space aware? Oh, Nathan Morgan, there you are. Nathan, I've just enabled you. Hello.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Excellent. Yeah, the problem we have is that when we're using DaVinci as an online tool, any effect that you put on in the edit page uses the timeline space, and for effects like Boris or Sapphire, some of those
Yes.
finish the full space.
Yes, yes. I've run into this myself, and it's always a pain. So I'm just going to answer off the top of my head because since this is a live question, I haven't had time to check it out on my own. So I'm just going to take a guess, which is always dangerous. It might be that if you change the color space of the node that you want to drop your resolve effect onto, that might help you out.
Totally. I think the biggest problem we're having is with like a transition effect that can only happen in the edit page.
Oh, yeah. No. In that case, I'm guessing you're probably doomed. I hate to say that because there may be a way. I'm trying to think. Because I don't typically use in my editing Boris transitions or anything like that, because all the projects that I edit are narrative cut and dissolve type stuff. That's not something I run into.
Gotcha.
You know what? I will record that question, and I will talk to colleagues, and I'll see if I can't get an answer for you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so that's all for ACES for now. I'm hoping that was useful to all of y'all, and I'm sure I will also get additional ACES questions that I can follow up on later on. But I believe those are the things that most people aren't quite getting when they ask about what's the deal with ACES. So hopefully that's cleared things up. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to some additional questions now. So first off, Magda Baez has a question. Magda, are you there? Are you out there, Magda? I don't believe she is. So I am going to go ahead and answer her question anyway. Magda Baez's question is, how would I solve technically footage with a lot of extreme light jumps? And I have a timeline I've put together for this. I don't have a lot of extreme light jumps, but I can show you what the techniques are. So I'm going to go back into my examples project. And I'm going to go into light jumps. And I've got this clip. And I'm going to give a shout out to Robbie Carmen, the colorist I mentioned earlier, who graciously let me use this clip for my color correction handbook. Because it's funny, when I need footage with problems in it, I can never find a good clip. So I'm always looking for clips that have specific issues. And this clip has the classic exposure bump in the middle of a shot that the editor just absolutely had to use. And this is in documentary work so common. And so I'll go into the manual way of dealing with this, and then I'll show the shortcut, which is really great. But the manual way is basically to make a keyframed adjustment. So in this particular shot, the first thing I want to do is I want to go to where the exposure is good and just do my grade. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in all those highlights that I can, maybe solidify those shadows a little bit, play around with those midtones. maybe warm it up, do whatever I'm going to do. And then once I've done that, and this is always a tip I like to give, I will create another node. I'll label this first node to be the primary. And in a second node, this is where I'm going to do my keyframing to try and fix this. I don't want to do my keyframing in my primary node, because if I screw this up, I want to be able to quickly reset and try it again, because this can be a fiddly thing to try and fix. And to fix it, I'm going to go ahead and turn on keyframing. And what I'm going to do is, I like to use the scopes when I do this. I'm going to scrub through the shot to find the frame where the exposure lands on where it's supposed to be. So that's right here. And I'm going to now go into my keyframe editor. This is node 3. So I'm going to turn on auto keyframing for corrector 3. I could also open this up and manually keyframe specifically the color track, but I'm in a hurry and I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is, with this auto keyframing button turned on, if you don't already know about this, any adjustment I make is going to spawn a keyframe. And I'm going to set my keyframes to color only, because I only want color keyframes. And what I'm going to do is, I'm actually going to wiggle sat and then reset it, just to drop a keyframe on that track, because this is where I'm going to. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a still for comparison. Now, this seems like kind of a linear adjustment. So the hope is that I can split screen this. And if I look at, again, my scopes to make this a little bit easier, the hope is that maybe I can, oh, duh. This is the classic mistake. I'm in log. I'm like, why isn't this working right? My God. So yes, the hope is that I can use these scopes to guide my adjustment so that everything is as matched from the first frame to that good frame as possible. And with this done, I can go ahead and turn off the split. And if I play through this, I'm good. Now, I've had shots where I have had to, I've had a bunch of like flicker, 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 and you end up doing a lot more keyframes, and it ends up being a lot more fiddly. And in those circumstances, usually I'll tell the client, look, I can make the flicker really a lot better. I can ameliorate it, and I can hopefully make it not noticeable, but I'm probably not going to be able to fix it perfectly. But at least I can take the edge off of that nastiness. And that's what happens, and it's usually works out great. However, there's another tool, and I don't know who knows about it and who doesn't, but it's really cool. I'm going to turn off this manually keyframe bit of business, and I'm going to turn off auto keyframing, because I don't want to inadvertently spawn more keyframes back in that node. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the color stabilizer. Raise your hand if you've used the color stabilizer. Go ahead and raise your hand. Anybody? Has anyone used the color stabilizer? Warren has, because Warren's a pro. Diego has. So if you don't know about the color stabilizer, you should, because it is fucking amazing. When it works. It doesn't always work, but when it works, it's amazing. So the way it works, the kind of easiest way to use it is with the default mode. You can see the settings here, region of analysis, selected area. You can also set it to be entire frame, but I'm just going to choose selected area because this camera isn't moving around much. And I'm going to move that to right over there. And I'm on a frame where the exposure is good. So I'm going to click Live Region Analysis. And now I'm going to play through. And this plugin has automatically taken care of that problem for me. If I turn it off, you can see that I go back to having that issue. If I turn it back on, you can see that life is good. So I've used this plugin on a wide variety of shots. Like I say, when it works great. I have had isolated instances in specific versions where it hasn't worked so great. But this is one of those things that gets improved a little bit every year. There are options. So if the camera is panning and you want to use live region analysis with a selected area because that's giving you the best result, you actually have the ability to keyframe the position of this box. You might, you know what, can you track this with the effects tracker? You might be able to track it with the effects tracker. Let me check. I am curious. This is just an experiment. I'm curious. If I track him. Okay, yeah, it looks like it's, if I go back to my effects. Okay, cool. So you can track this with the effects tracker if you had to. This is nonsense. I'm just testing it because I didn't know for sure. But if the camera's panning, you can track this to stay on the same feature using the effects tracker, which is nice. The other thing you can do is you can go to entire frame, which is a different mode of working. And that's analyzing the whole frame. But I can see now that I'm getting a less perfect result because it's looking at them as well. So in this case, selected area is better. And I'm good. So anyway, color stabilizer can save you a lot of fiddling around. So that's a great tool. I wanted everyone to know about that. So yeah, that's what I do with light jumps. So now moving on, Mark Osborne. I have been dragging you into conversations for 3 episodes now. I'm finally giving you a question. So you asked me about why, and I'm needing to move my windows around to read this note. The question is, why is some highlight information suppressed by early base grades or LUTs and only accessible by going before the base grade or LUT as opposed to a later node in the chain? I thought all detail was supposed to be accessible to the 32-bit floating point. So it's funny. This used to be a really easy thing for me to demo, Mark, because all I would do is I actually tried to set this up. If I go into order of operations. So I've got this shot right here. And this is setting things up using the color space transform, and I have a node before it and a node after it. And so what I was trying to set up was in the first node, I'm just crushing those shadows, right? I don't know why I would do this, but this always used to be the easiest way to demo where the data would fall down on you. So I crush it before that. And then what I would do is I would expand that data, and it would be blindingly obvious that the values aren't, the pixels aren't as nice as they were before. They're not terrible, but they're not great. But the funny thing is, if I A/B between before and after that silliness, it's not terrible. In fact, it's not even bad. It's just slightly off because I wasn't careful about how I expanded it.
Mm-hmm.
And I do know that this has been a focus of the engineering team's efforts over the last few years, is taking better advantage of that 32-bit floating point internal space and preserving data with greater and greater fidelity year over year. I just hadn't realized they did this good a job.
Oh, yeah.
So I can tell you anecdotally, and of course I can't do this during the webinar, that grading HDR, when I do my sort of lazy workflow of having a full HDR grade and then using color space transform to create an SDR version of that, which I then trim to better fit into 709. In those instances, when I'm grading like 3000 nit highlights, I have noticed on skies that are very flat with not a whole lot of range in them, like hazy skies, that I do lose a lot of detail, and I have to go underneath the color space transform that's taking me from HDR to 709 to kind of duck those skies back a little bit and get a little bit more range. But
Yeah.
that's a very specific case. I thought it would be easily replicated in the shadows, but apparently it's not. I'm guessing, I'm guessing what it is there's greater bit fidelity in those shadows. That's where I've got all my detail. That's where I've got all of my numeric precision, I should say. Whereas up in those highlights, as you and I were discussing offline, there isn't nearly the kind of numeric precision in the highlights because of the way those bits are apportioned in the HDR signal. So that, I suspect, is a specifically HDR issue.
Oh, well, can I expand on what
Sure.
my issue was?
Please.
And I'm only looking at your example on my phone, so I'm going to have to go back later and look at it on my big iMac 5K screen. But,
okay.
This just happens to be a lot where, I start with an 18 node structure when I begin. It's got tons of things that I do every day. And there was a movie I was working on in a theater earlier this year where they had designed a great LUT that we used in node 1 in the base. It was great, and it got us 90% there. But every once in a while, we come into an instance where the DP go, oh, looks like my LUT's really blowing the shit out of this area. And the highlights are gone. So
yes.
I have a parallel node ready to go with two different luminance keys as a parallel, drawing from, I think it's drawing from my second node, the contrast node, the one right after my base.
Mm-hmm.
And when I try to go down, you look at your scopes and it's staying locked. It's staying flat. It just, it's hard to explain, but it's not, there's information, because when I hit raw, you see that there's detail there. So when I just tried to pull it down from this parallel node, it was just flattening out. It wasn't truly grabbing the meat of the highlights. So right. I did a before current. I just did a before current, before the base or before the LUT. And sure enough, as if I was drawing from, as if I only had one node on there, I had all that access and I could pull down those highlights wherever I wanted them. They look clean. So I always just understood the 32-bit. I thought you could get that from anywhere in the structure, but I found over the years that's not true. You have to sort of you got to sometimes go below things to get to get
Right.
access to those pixels.
So this is, I'm glad we went in this direction, because LUTs are a more specific case. And this is where I get to sell you on the color space transform.
Okay.
So I've just set up this normalization node to use a LUT rather than color space transform. And the thing about LUTs is that they have upper and lower boundaries. That's just the way they are.
Oh.
And if you feed a LUT data outside of those boundaries, that data will be clipped, period. So if I go before this LUT and I do something idiotic, like, you know, just blow out the highlights and the shadows, and then I go after the LUT and I try to bring that stuff back, you can see it's gone.
Yes, yeah, that's the flatten I was talking about.
I overdrove the LUT, right?
Yeah.
So this is the textbook case for why you have a node before the LUT that is basically compressing the image to make it fit inside the box of the LUT.
Yeah.
In order to make sure that the LUT is able to operate on the image correctly. Now here's the sell, here's the pitch, right? So I've done this with a LUT. I'm gonna go ahead and make another node. And in this node, I'm gonna drop the color space transform, and I'm gonna set that color space transform to be red wide gamut, and go down to log 3G10. And if I command drag this on there, so now the normalization is happening with the color space transform. If I go to that ladder node, I actually have the data still.
Yeah.
I'm now able to retrieve it. Now, here's what I'm talking about. It's squished to hell because what I'm doing is stupid.
Right.
But you can see there are the highlights with the color space transform that the LUT wouldn't give you. This is why I've stopped using LUTs for normalization and I only use color space transform, because the color space transform is a smooth mathematical operation that operates over the entire signal that you feed it. It doesn't clip anything.
Well, and I must say, I don't use LUTs very often, only when I see that they're well designed, if they come from someone else other than myself.
Totally. I'm not throwing stones about LUT usage.
Well, no,
I'm just saying, when it comes to jobs where you want to save yourself a little bit of time by not normalizing manually, and the way I approach my work is, it's based on how much of my day someone's paying for. If I'm grading on a reality job and they're like, look, you need to do a 40-minute episode a day, and they're insane, and you got all this work to do to make it look decent, then I'm not manually grading that log. I'm using a color space transform to normalize it. I'm using tone mapping to give me good highlight detail to start with. And then I've got more time to put into making those images their best. If I'm working for a client that's giving me a healthy amount of time to do really detailed, beautiful grading of their feature, then I'm taking the time and I'm making bespoke normalizations for 709 and all that. And that's how I break it down for people. It's not that I'm trying to get out of doing a good job, and it's not that the color space transform node does a bad job. It does a wonderful job, as you can see. It's just an approach based on how much time you want to put into something, how much time you have.
Exactly. I mean, I do the same thing. I do try transforms every now and then, just as long as they're not breaking anything. And otherwise, I'll just still create my own basic transform. I'll create a curve that kind of gets you 80% there, so you're not working super hard. You throw it on everything to start, then you go back and refine shots.
Right.
But I was finding this problem happening even without LUTs. Just let's say my base grade just has a good strong contrast. And if I tried to get a detail from like node 22.
Mhm.
I found that, oh crap, I can't get that detail as good as if I maybe make a parallel node and draw from below it, or I keep a pre-base LUT, or sorry, a pre-base node like underneath. It's basically a before current. I keep a couple of them ready to go underneath any, whether I put a LUT or just a strong base grade. So it's
Gotcha.
always, I can always access that. I just was always curious. I mean, I have no problem getting the detail I need in DaVinci. I just didn't understand why I couldn't get it from like a way farther away node, like a later node in the chain,
Right.
as good as earlier. So
Yeah, I mean that's just the traditional boundary issues that LUTs have always had. It's just a limitation of that method of image processing.
Gotcha. All right, thank you for explaining
Sure.
that.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So next, I have a question from Alicia Slough, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Alicia, I see you're there. Hello.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah.
Am I getting your name right?
No, that's okay. It's always mispronounced slow. It's actually pronounced Slough.
Slough. Alicia
Yeah.
Slough. Okay. I just want to, my last name is tricky for some people too, so I get it.
Yeah, no problem.
So you had a really nice question. How do you approach creating color separation and making the hero pop out in a scene when their skin tone, hair color, and background all live in the same color world? And I can't tell you how many times on lower budgeted productions I've run into this as a function of rushed art direction. I'm guessing you've run into the same issue, given that you're asking this question.
Yeah, exactly. I'm working on something right now where I think I have it to a good point where it doesn't look quite so mushy and the same, but it's certainly a problem that I've come up with time and time again. And so I'm just curious to hear how you approach it, or anyone else too. What are some techniques that you do? Knowing that obviously you could really correct this if you gave yourself more time when you're shooting and art direction and everything else.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, I try not to give my clients too hard a time, because I'm a filmmaker too, and I get it. You're in a hurry and you don't always have as much money as you wish, and you gave your production designer $100 to make the scene look good, and they rolled their eyes and did their best. And you end up with, beige clothing against a beige wall with a warm color scheme.
Right.
So if you're looking at your display, this is a clip from a music video that I got many years ago. This is an example in my book. And it's my textbook example, literally, for this situation where their skin tone is squarely in line with the light that's coming from the dominant illuminant of the scene. Everything's getting the same light. It's all very warm. And so everything's very close together. And it looks technically correct, because you can tell they're getting the same light as everything else. So it makes sense that they'd be a little yellowish. But it doesn't necessarily make them pop. And one of the notes was, is there any way you can make the talent stand out more? And this is basically, there's two approaches that you can take. Is you either isolate the background and push the color somewhere away from the talent, or you isolate the talent and you push them away from the background. If I go into the vector scope and I zoom in, go ahead and turn on 2x zoom, you can see that there isn't a lot of color contrast in this image in terms of extensions of hue, right? They're all reds through yellows, and that's pretty much it. And that's why everything seems so monochromatic, because it almost is.
Yeah.
So the easiest thing usually to do, and usually when you're in this situation, the talent is getting unflattering light. So you probably have to do something to their skin tone anyway. So isolating the talent is generally going to be your fastest solution, and it'll probably give you the most joy. The first thing I always try to see if I can get away with it, and I'm going to create another node to do this, is I will go into my hue versus hue curve and I'll sample some of that cheek, and then I'll wiggle it around to see, is this going to do what I need it to do? Now, this isn't the correction I want to make. This is just seeing how much of the image gets hit by this operation that I'm trying to do in a hurry. Because the beauty of the hue curves is that they roll off very smoothly from the pixels you're affecting to the pixels that are not being affected. So it can be a very gentle adjustment that's nonetheless fairly focused. But in a situation like this, where all of the values are really close together, it's, as you can see, this is not a winning strategy. I don't necessarily want to get their hair. I don't necessarily want to get that picture in the background. So in this case, I generally move straight to some kind of a qualification, pulling a key so that I can grade the skin tone within that key. And when it comes to the qualifiers, I mean, you know, you could draw shapes, but in this situation, that's going to be a lot of roto for a job that I probably don't have a ton of time for. And I'm not lucky enough to have a team of roto artists working with me. If I want to, you know, isolate that hand, I'm doing it myself. And so I don't want to do that. So I come from more of a VFX background. I was an editor and then a VFX artist, and then I fell into color. So I'm, from talking to other colorists I know, I'm maybe a little more inclined to jump into doing a key than other people. But that's just because I don't want to roto. I really, really don't. So I will jump into the qualifier, and there are two qualifiers that would help me in this situation. The regular Hsl qualifier, and then if you're using Resolve specifically, and this is not unique to Resolve, by the way. All of these techniques are available in just about every grading workstation there is. Resolve has a 3D qualifier that's really nice. And in this case, because I'm trying to make such a specific adjustment and the skin tone is so close to everything else, I'm going to use the 3D qualifier because the 3D qualifier is good for making really specific keys. And the way that works is you just drag a line over what you want to key. And then if you turn on your key, you can see how well you did. So this doesn't necessarily look fantastic, but I can hold the Option key down and drag over what I don't want to be keyed. And now all of a sudden, I'm able to start subtracting things from this key. And what's nice is every sample I do gets logged in this list. So if I do something that ended up not being a good idea, I can go ahead and bin it, and I'm good. And if I play through here, you can see this is a very stable key. And I didn't have to do a whole ton of work. Now, I've got these holes where the shadows are, but the thing I always try to tell students when I'm working in classes is when you're keying to adjust skin tone, it's not the same thing as if you're keying a superhero in front of a green screen because you want to make them fly. You're not keying the person. What you're keying is the pool of light that is really the subject of your adjustment. You don't necessarily care if those darker shadows are not going to get this adjustment we're making because they're darker shadows. They have less color in them anyway. So that's probably okay. I do care about these little speckles because I don't want any chatter. And that's a highlight. So what I can do is I move to the matte finesse controls. I don't want to add more than 2 or 3 samples here generally, because if the more samples you add, the crunchier your mask gets. And we have post key adjustment of the matte that we can do, which is what all these matte finesse controls are here. So if I turn up clean black, that cleans up any speckling in the outside of the matte. And if I turn up clean white, that lets me tune up the inside of the matte. And so by adjusting those two controls, I get a really nice smooth roll off. And if I need to keep screwing around, you know, you can blur the edge a wee bit. I wouldn't overuse this. And you can also push the matte into or out of what you're doing. So you have a lot of control over the matte that gets pulled. You don't have to do all of your heavy lifting with the samples. And now that I've got this set up, it's easy for me to just go back to, and I can turn off those paths if I don't want them distracting me. And now I can go and adjust that skin tone to maybe push it a little more towards red, or maybe more towards a less saturated red. Just push them in a different direction. It doesn't take much to lift them away from what's happening in the background. And then if you don't want to push the skin tone harder than you've decided you have the option of creating an outside node. And what an outside node is it's basically a node that's automatically connected to the matte created in node 2, but that's inverted. So now using this outside node, I can make an adjustment to push the world in a different direction. And I can get
really helpful.
I could get as much separation as I want. So yeah, that's it. That's the beginning and the end of it. This is
funny.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I did this the very hard way, but eventually got to a similar path. But it resolves so great that you have like many different tools to solve the similar problem or the same problem that you might come up with time and time again. But you forget about all these other tools unless you use them, or features unless you use them day in and day out. And this would have saved me so much time.
I know. And then new tools get added and you're too busy to learn about them.
Yeah.
So you go a year and then you finally learn about it and you're like, oh my God, that would have saved me a month of this year if I'd known about that thing, right?
Yeah.
I'll give you a tip, because if you're asking yourself, when would I use HSL and when would I use 3D? That is a completely fair question, and that's the road to efficiency, because I have found in my work that if I'm working with heavily compressed imagery, the 3D keyer is so specific that it sometimes gets hung up on macro blocks and artifacts. And you'll go, why is my 3D key so garbagey? And the truth is, it's finding the boundaries of your artifacts. It's such a good keyer.
Yeah.
And in that situation, I generally find the Hsl qualifier is far, far superior because it's not as finicky. With really high quality footage, the 3D keyer can often be faster if you're trying to be more specific. But the HSL keyer can sometimes be faster if what you're doing isn't hugely specific. Mm-hmm. And the one tip I'll give you about the HSL keyer, let me turn these nodes off and I'll add one more node, because this is worth knowing, is I'll go ahead and do a sample. And when I look at the result, yeah, that's not bad. But do you see how tight the center is?
Yeah.
This has always been the issue with Resolve, is the center is usually not wide enough. Well, in this case, the center is actually pretty good. But if you look at the face, the center is usually not wide enough by default. And so my recommendation for most images that aren't this one is the first thing I do is I change the width of the center, and that immediately gets you a better key with HSL, assuming, you know, you've got a different image that isn't also including all this junk in the background. But that's the big tip I give people with the HSL qualifier is start with width, because the width is almost always 99% of the time too narrow, and opening that up will give you a better result. So yeah, there you go.
This is great. Thank you so much. It's always good to be reminded about other tools and just how to be more efficient with these things.
My pleasure. What can I ask you? What kind of work do you do?
Yeah, I do a bunch of different things. I haven't done a feature yet, but I've done commercials, music videos, short films, that kind of world.
Mm-hmm. What's
Yeah.
what part of the world are you in?
Oh, I live in Philadelphia, or outside of Philadelphia.
Cool.
In the US. Yeah.
Is there a big post market in Philadelphia?
Not hugely. I get work from New York, or there's definitely work in Philadelphia, and a lot of filmmakers actually, but most of it I would say comes from probably New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me. If you got any more questions, go ahead and submit them. I'd love to talk to you some more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye.
All right. So I'm a little over time, but I want to take on one more question because Warren Eagles had a question, and I definitely want to get to him. Warren, I'm turning you on. Hello, Warren. Are you there?
Hey, Alexis.
Warren, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
I'm very good. This is a fun thing to be doing. For those of you who don't know, Warren is one of the lead instructors with I'll let you pitch the name.
International Colorist Academy.
The International Colorist Academy.
I spend half my time running around doing training classes and half the time coloring here in Australia.
Yes, and you have a very diverse clientele from seeing you on social media. You do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, it's one of the things here, probably like most people who work freelance now around the world, you're basically, as a colorist, putting your hand up to do anything, which I like because it makes it very interesting. So it's anything from like YouTube stuff all the way up to movies and everything in between, which is fun.
Yeah. Have you found that today's generation of client is not so interested in typecasting colorists? Like when I was getting started in New York, I, by sheer coincidence, did a bunch of documentaries in a row, and all of a sudden I was the documentary colorist. And I'm like, well, I can color other things too. But it was so easy for people to go, oh yeah, Alexis, he's the documentary colorist. Go to him with your doc. That I found it momentarily hard to get other kinds of jobs until I had done more of them. Have you found that that's not so much the case these days?
Yeah, definitely, you're right. And Mark probably back us up on that as well. Is that feature guys are now moving into more long form TV, and commercial guys are going the other way, going to do features. There's much more of a crossover than there used to be, so it's easier in that respect.
Cool. Well, that's good to hear, because that was always a pain in the ass. So you had a question about stabilization, and I went ahead and created a project for you. Stabilization with a bunch of clips. And wait a minute. I thought I created a project with a bunch of clips. Where are all the other clips? Where are they? Did I put them in here? Oh, here they are. Let me just get them out of there and put them into here. So your question was, stabilization either works great or it fails, and I struggle to know where to go when it fails.
Yeah.
And I sympathize, because there's a certain element of auto magicalness to the stabilizer. And if you run through the available options and you don't get a good result, they're really, the fallback plan is to use the older stabilizer. So I'll just go ahead and run through what I know and see if any of it is something you don't know already. And otherwise, everyone else will learn all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, no,
But
sure.
the other problem I find I have is whenever I want to demo something like this, I try to grab a couple clips, and they all end up stabilizing great, and so I can't show the problem. So let's see how this goes. I've got this clip right here, and by the way, for those of you out there who don't know this, the stabilizer has been added to the edit page. And if I make this full height, everything but the stabilizer graph is now available on the edit page, and it is the exact same set of controls that creates the same data as the stabilizer on the color page. So whether the editor uses it in the edit page or the colorist uses it in the color page, it's writing to the same place, it's the same data, it's the same thing. You just don't have all these other controls in the edit page. The edit page keeps it
Alexis,
simple.
can I just ask, do we get a notification of that as an icon in the color page?
Yes, you do. So I'm going to go to this clip right here, which if I go into the color page and turn on clips, you can see it does not have this stabilization icon on it. So if I go to the edit page and I just hit stabilize and let it do its thing, then not only is it stabilized, but when I go back to the color page, there is my indication that somebody did that. And you also, if you go into this really easy to miss pop-up by clips, you have the ability to filter this clips timeline specifically by, I thought there was a stabilization.
Maybe it's
group.
tracked.
Yeah,
It's the
maybe
same
it's
icon.
Yeah, probably. So it's tracked. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So you can filter by tracked / stabilized.
Nice.
And that'll just show you those stabilized clips, so you can look to make sure that the editor did a good job, or if there are any issues that you think you can address better. So to turn that off, you have to go back up here and choose all clips, and you're good. So I'm hopeful, and this is a funny thing. I can say this because this movie is done and I don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm hopeful this will expose a problem for me. So by default, the stabilizer, which has 3 modes of operation: perspective stabilization, similarity, and translation. Perspective is attempting to corner pin the image to give you a good stabilization. So it's doing a warp to try and make things good. But when it fails, you can get this fluttering effect in the background. Let's see if that happens here. So I'm just going to click stabilize. One of the things that was done in version 16 was to make this a lot faster than it used to be. So even though this is a long clip, that just happens. So you can see this has got a lot going on. Let's play through it. And what I'm looking, there. Did you see that?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of fluttering that looks a little odd. And if you know you're going to zoom into this and crop it out, that would be one solution. But if you want this full wide, maybe that's not the best. So the immediate fallback plan is to switch to similarity, which does X, Y, and rotation, but it does not do any warping. So when perspective gives you a poor result, you can switch this to similarity, reanalyze, and then see what you get. And I would say 80% of the time when I have a problem with perspective, similarity gives me a great result. Now, this is a wide angle lens, which just has some weirdness at the edges anyway. So again, this isn't probably the best example, but you can see the difference.
Yeah.
that I got there. And then if similarity is also giving you a terrible result, you can switch to translation. That's simply doing an XY stabilization. And it's probably going to be the least useful thing, but it does come in handy for one or two situations.
Now, you can save these in the gallery and recall these information, this stabilizing information, correct?
I am pretty sure that you can. Let's test it. I'll grab this still. I'll go ahead and just reset this grade and reset that. And if I apply this, oh, wait. Let's not forget, I set this to color.
Yeah, there's another gotcha.
Yeah. There it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does save it. You do actually, let me see, there's a setting where,
tell it, don't you?
yeah, where
on
is
the
that?
gray background.
Oh, on the background, right.
Yeah.
Apply grades using
That's the one.
keyframes aligning source time load. Boom. Now we've got the correct thing. So yeah, two little instructional gotchas for people. And so that's, if that doesn't work, I mean, the other thing is you can try different smoothing ratios with either perspective or similarity, and maybe easing off the smoothing will make it work better for you.
Yeah.
The other possibility is, and I'm really glad they did this, you can switch to the classic stabilizer. And the classic stabilizer, while technically speaking not as advanced an algorithm as the Wi-Fi new stabilizer, does have the advantage of retaining the interactive mode cloud tracker workflow that you have with tracking. So you can go to interactive mode and deliberately delete points you don't want tracked, and you can see if that works. And this is a completely different algorithm. So if you've got a really thorny shot, this might actually give you joy where the other one fails, just because it's a different method that gives you different options. So this is one fallback plan. And Warren, I'm sure you've used this for years, right?
Yes.
You know this well.
Yeah, I was more familiar with that. It was the newer one. I just wasn't sure what those new features were doing.
Right. They're simply choosing the correct algorithm for analyzing those vectors of motion. That's what each of those settings. That's why when you choose another setting, by the way, before I leave this, I just want to point out that you can also choose a point tracker in this mode, and you can choose to track one particular thing as part of your stabilization. So that's another, that was a late breaking feature of the classic stabilizer that is still a unique thing that's only available in the classic stabilizer that can be useful. The other thing you can do with this is you can create multiple stabilization points, but the trick is, if you're going to use 2 points to try and get rotation, you need to place them on the same plane of perspective. If I put this one here and this one over here, the result's going to be garbage, because these are totally different planes of perspective. I really need to make sure that it's this pillar and this pillar, right? That makes sense. So that's the thing there. But if I go back to the GPU accelerated stabilizer, really the only thing you can do is choose which algorithm you're going to use. When you change algorithms, you do have to restabilize, and you go through the whole rigmarole. Is it just me, or is it going slower now?
I'd say it is slow, yeah.
Did I? Oh, you know what I did? I turned off use GPU acceleration. So that's an option. I'm guessing because when they implemented it, they were worried that if there was a bug in that, people would have no choice but to use the new way. I don't think it has a bug. So we just have this option to turn it off and make it slower. So there we go.
Thanks.
Back to being fast. But when you do this analysis, You only have to do it the long way once. And then if you update smooth strength and cropping ratio and click stabilize again, all you're doing is operating with the existing data. It's only when you change algorithms that you've got to re-stabilize and it goes through the whole thing again.
Yeah.
So there's nothing you're missing. That's really it. If this doesn't work,
Yep.
your option is try another stabilizer. And if that doesn't work, then, you know,
So you're right. I'm being the old school color guy. You'll get clients that go, "Oh, this thing has a stabilizer in it, doesn't it? Do you think you could do something with that shot?" So I look at it, look at the shot, and go, "Well, that doesn't look too bad. I can probably do that." And then you jump in and you do it, and you're getting the rubbery pictures, and you're thinking, maybe I shouldn't have offered up that solution. And then you're backtracking and sort of suggesting you might be able to fix it later on.
Yeah.
So, but
So
I think I'm basically probably was doing what you were doing anyway.
I'm running into that issue with a project I'm grading right now, where I agreed to do, I like doing the finishing in Resolve because then I can just render out one big chunk and be done with it. And I would say most of the time, the things I'm doing in Resolve are better than whatever they're doing and whatever NLE they're using. So I usually have a fair amount of confidence, but there's this one shot I've got that is not stabilizing at all. And if you looked at the shot, the camera motion is confusingly wiggly. Like, I don't understand why it's as wiggly as it is. But, you know, whatever. It's the shot they have, and that's the one they want to use. So Resolve Stabilizer does a really good job, except for 2 bumps. And it's terrible. These 2 bumps drive me crazy. And I can't get rid of them. And I'm thinking, you know, I know he cut in Premiere, so I'm going to take that shot back into Premiere on my own and see if Premiere is really doing a better job. And if it is, great. I'll just stabilize it in Premiere, render it out, and bring it back into Resolve. I don't need to try and make Resolve better than it is. But I've had this happen in the past, and I'll bet you have too.
Yeah.
Where you do your stabilization and you're like, God, this isn't as good as I want it to be. I feel bad about giving this to the client. And then, you know, the client shows you what they had and it was just as bad, probably with the same issue. And they had made their peace with it. And you're like, oh, okay, well, great, I guess. Yeah, it's tough. Stabilization is tough.
It's very hard to do, isn't it? I had a guy in a class who said, "Oh, you know, I don't really rate the stabilizer in Resolve." He said, "Give me the shot. I'm going to have a go in After Effects." And this is during the class, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's like left what I'm doing and he's fiddling away and he's in After Effects. And after 15 minutes, he's come up and he is similar. It's no
right.
better.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It just was a very hard shot. And however way you're going to look at it, it wasn't really getting any better. And that's after he spent 15, 20 minutes on it. Still really couldn't nail it.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that I've had exactly the same issue where people will badmouth Resolve Stabilizer. And then you say, well, show me your better stabilization. And most of the time, the memory of what they had done before was better than what they did. And you look at it and you're like, well, this actually isn't really, it's a little different, but I wouldn't say it's better. It's just having issues with other parts of that shot. And it's hard, but my experience has been, if you give Resolve I'm gonna call it a professionally destabilized result, right? Like, you were using decent camera support and you were doing things professionally, and there was still it was a hard move and it had wiggle in it, or, you know, it just, no amount of equipment would make that move smooth. If you feed it those kinds of shots, it nails them time after time after time. It's only the shots that are really rough, handheld, by someone who's not learned how to pivot with their body, and you get these sharp bumps or jolts. Those are the things that defeat it. But as you say, those are hard for every single stabilizer out there. Those are just hard things. And if you do stabilize it, then you get this motion blur fizzing on those frames, and it's still no good, and it makes you crazy. So it's,
you know the technical term for that problem, Alexis?
what is it?
Rubber pictures.
Rubber pictures. I will remember that. I will remember that. That is apt. I always called it fizzing because it looks like a, you know, you open a can of soda pop and it goes.
Yeah. Rubber pictures.
Rubber pictures.
Stretching pictures. Yeah, it's all rubbery.
Rubber baby bumpers.
Yeah. All right, man. Thanks very much for that.
All right. Thank you. And on that question,
Yeah.
I will conclude today's episode. So thank you, everyone, for participating. This was a lot of cool stuff that we went through. I've got plenty more questions for next week, but again, if you have more questions that you would like to ask, go to my website, submit them on the forum, and I'll get them fit in sooner or later. Thanks for coming.